Thank you, everyone. Welcome back. I hope everyone enjoyed their lunch. We have a few more speakers now, and then we'll have another break at 3. We're starting now with Kevin Perry, who is going to give us an amazing presentation about dust.
So I'm just curious, how many of you have seen a wall of dust moving off of Great Salt Lake that looks something like that? Yeah, exactly. We know that these dust events, these dust storms like that, we call those dust storms, happen kind of 3 to 5 times a year because we all see them, we all notice them. But what we don't know is smaller dust events that are smaller scale that are contributing particulate matter to the surrounding environment. And people are always asking me the question of whether or not Great Salt Lake dust is posing health hazards to everybody that lives along the Wasatch Front. And, the scientist in me, looks at this and says, well, of course, it has to be with this many people and the amount of dust that's coming off. But we don't have the data to actually demonstrate that yet. And one of the things I'm going to be reporting on is a little bit of information on what the state is doing to try and quantify the risks associated with exposure to Great Salt Lake, but also what the state is potentially looking at in terms of what to do about mitigating dust if it is, in fact, causing significant health hazards for the people that live downwind, which is everybody from Tremonton all the way through Farmington, Salt Lake City, all the way over to Tooele and down to Provo and up to Logan. We all live downwind of the lake when it comes to dust. So with that in mind, we'll keep moving forward. The work that I'm presenting on is part of the Great Salt Lake Basin Integrated Plan gap analysis. So the state has been working very hard on the Great Salt Lake Basin Integrated Plan. The work plan was completed in 2024. The final plan is due supposedly in November of 26, or so I've heard. And as part of the original work plan, they identified many different areas that required additional research in order to quantify the issues. So everything from stormwater to water requirements for birds, the quantification of evaporation from Great Salt Lake, et cetera. And what I'm presenting on is just another one of those studies that looked at the gap analysis for options and costs for dust control. I want to always say that just because we are coming up with a palette of options for engineered solutions for dust control does not mean that the state has committed to engineered dust controls. They just want to make sure that they're doing their due diligence. So if the need arises as we move down forward and there is a health risk associated with it, that they'll have tools in their belt in order to be able to try and deal with the dust to mitigate it. The results that I'm presenting here are a report that came out that was released in February the 12th of this year for the state. It's got 4 different chapters. The first is basically what's the problem and what's the report's role, under what conditions would dust mitigation actually be warranted, what can we actually realistically do about dust, and more importantly, what would it cost? I don't intend this to be a horror show, but I think that the results of this will hopefully scare the heck out of you when it comes to the costs associated with dust mitigation. And we learn these lessons about dust mitigation costs from our collaborators and partners in the state of California, who have been dealing with dust from dried up lake beds in Owens Lake and Mono Lake and Salton Sea for decades. And the numbers that I actually will be presenting today are based upon actual boots-on-the-ground costs associated with dust mitigation at those California ecosystems. So let's talk about the physics of dust generation. Dust emission from a lake bed like Great Salt Lake depends upon a lot of different things. Soil moisture is super important when it comes to dust emission. We have to have dry soil. Every winter, the playa gets wet enough to reset the crust and minimize the dust potential during the wintertime. But as the season moves in, the sun gets stronger, the playa starts to dry out, and eventually you hit a threshold where dust emission is possible. I used to say that the wintertime was too wet for dust emission, but I've now seen dust events coming off of the Great Salt Lake in every month of the year, because we've had very dry Januaries and Februaries in the past. This year, we already had dust events in February and March. Not so much in April because it got wetter, which was nice. Other things for consideration about dust coming off of a surface is the crust. Luckily, Great Salt Lake is covered, about 75% of the lake is covered in a protective crust that shields the underlying sediment from the wind. That crust is our friend. It reforms every winter and then slowly dries out depending upon the meteorology of the specific year, the spring, the summer, the fall. And that surface crust is our friend. And once that crust starts to break down, either through natural processes of saltation, where you have sand particles that are bouncing along can break the crust, or mechanical disturbance from vehicles or traffic or other things out on the lake bed, then those areas can become dust sources. Surface roughness. How fast does the wind speed go right close to the surface? And that depends upon the surface roughness. How smooth is the surface? Is there vegetation out there? Are there rocks or stones out on the surface? All of these things can slow the wind speed down and reduce the dust emission potential. So vegetation can play an important role at dust suppression. Particle size distribution is really important as well. If you go to the beach and you grab a handful of sand and you throw it up in the air, what happens? It comes right back down. You get kicked off the beach, people yell at you, that sort of thing. But it doesn't stay suspended in the atmosphere. If you go to a farmer's field and do the same thing with a handful of dirt, you throw it up in the air, the big clouds come back down, and the smaller particles will waft away. The smaller particles are silt and clay, and basically we need that in the parent material in order to generate dust. So where does that silt and clay come from? It's delivered to Great Salt Lake from the rivers, the Bear River, the Weber River, and the Jordan River. So you can imagine that the eastern side of Great Salt Lake has a lot more silt and clay than other portions of the lake bed. Unfortunately, now of course that's the area that's closest to where we all live. So putting those two things together is not great for dust emission and exposure. Mineralogy also plays an important role. We can have salt crusts on certain parts of the lake bed that act as another way, in addition to physical crusts, that can reduce the wind potential. So most of you know me as Dr. Dust. I'm the person who obviously went out there to identify where the dust hotspots were at. That's a whole other story of my life. But we've got dust hotspots in each quadrant of the lake, and they're circled there in red. The ones that are probably most concerning for human health are actually up in Bear River Bay and Farmington Bay. And the ones in Farmington Bay, you'll notice, are preferentially on the eastern side of Farmington Bay, even closer to where people are building closer and closer to the lake bed out there. So one of the things that I like to do is to try and put this into perspective. If we look at the history of non-attainment for air quality in Utah, when I go out to a group like this, and I generally ask, how many of you think that the air quality in Utah is worse today than it was 20 years ago? A lot of people will raise their hand. That's not actually true. Air quality has gotten a lot better in the last 30 years. And you can see that here in the criteria air pollutants, the history going back to the 1980s. Back in the 1980s and 1990s, we were in non-attainment for 3, 4 of the criteria air pollutants, including particles, PM10, PM2.5, carbon monoxide, ozone, and sulfur dioxide. And through the efforts of federal regulations and the Division of Air Quality and new regulations on emissions, most of these criteria air pollutants have gotten under control. We're now in compliance for PM10. We're now in compliance for PM2.5. The only one that we're really out of compliance for is ozone, which is a serious health hazard. But if dust from the lake becomes more frequent, it may reverse this trend that we have been seeing of improving air quality in our region and put us back into a time period where we have more than one criteria air pollutant that we have in non-attainment for, which means non-attainment is basically the regulatory definition of unhealthy air. So one of the things that the report outlined is a recommended decision framework for trying to determine when dust mitigation might actually be warranted. And the report basically identified what I'm calling the weight of evidence framework. It's something that is used by the Environmental Protection Agency. And it basically says that mitigation decisions shouldn't be based only on a single metric. That we don't necessarily have to wait until we have violations of the national ambient air quality standards to know that we need to do dust mitigation if the weight of the evidence shows that the people are being harmed by dust exposure. And how do we quantify those risks? Well, we use air quality monitoring data. We do source attribution to find out how much of the dust event was coming from Great Salt Lake versus the West Desert or other upwind sources. Now, we look to our research community to look at epidemiological relationships between exposure to dust and human outcomes. We look at the toxicological characterization of the dust. Is there things in the dust that are particularly harmful that we don't want to be exposed to? And then we also look at which communities are most likely to be severely impacted by the dust. We have model results that tend to show that areas north and northeast of Farmington Bay are some of the hardest hit communities, but we don't have actual monitors up in that region to quantify or verify those modeling results. But this weight of evidence framework basically brings together all of this different information, and then you have to have somebody who actually uses that information to make decisions about whether or not we're going to invest in dust mitigation. And the report basically identified the Utah Division of Air Quality as being the entity that is probably best suited to look at the risks associated with dust exposure, with scientific oversight being provided by the Utah Air Quality Board. And then once those two organizations have vetted the information, and then they can work with policymakers, the legislature and the governor, to actually implement dust mitigation. So what's the state actually doing? Well, the Utah's approach to this problem right now is to start monitoring the dust. If you haven't heard already, the state has now funded a Utah Dust Observation and Research Network. And that network will be dramatically expanding the locations where we're monitoring dust around Great Salt Lake. It'll extend all the way down to the severe dry lake and delta. It'll extend over upwind of the lake so that we'll have we'll expand the number of monitors from 6 to about 20 monitors in northern Utah. And it'll do both real-time monitoring and filter-based monitoring so that we can look at the chemical composition of the dust as well. The state has hired a dust scientist, Professor or Dr. Zach Onderud, previously at Brigham Young University, is now the state dust scientist who will be focusing on these sorts of things. This dust monitoring network will answer the real questions of how frequent is Great Salt Lake dust, how severe is it, which communities are being hardest hit, and it'll be able to assess the actual health risks associated with that. In the meantime, everybody else that we've heard about is talking about working on trying to restore Great Salt Lake to ecological health by raising the levels up to at least 4198. And if you do that, it will actually cover up a lot of the dust hotspots and we'll get dust control as a co-benefit. The report that I'm talking about today is basically, well, if we monitor the dust, and it is causing a health problem, and we can't get to 4198 quickly enough, and we need to address the health risks, then dust control measures might be necessary. So, give you an example. Here's Farmington Bay with an overlay of the dust hotspots, the circles, and then an overlay of the elevation of the lake up to 4198. If you were to get the lake up to 4198 in Farmington Bay, it would cover up about 40% of the dust hotspots in Farmington Bay, which would significantly reduce the dust emissions. But would it be enough to cause it to be not harmful to the people that live downwind? We don't know yet, but the monitoring will allow us to quantify not only what the concentrations are coming off the lake now, but how that changes over time as we try and restore the lake to health. Even at 4198, there's still 12 square miles of exposed lake bed in Farmington Bay. So the report outlines 12 different engineered solutions. I'm not advocating for any of these, but they're trying to put together a tool belt that the state could theoretically use. 6 of these engineered solutions require water. This involves permanent shallow flooding, precision surface wetting, using sprinklers to keep the surface wet, dynamic water management, moving water around on the playa to reset the crust and let Mother Nature suppress the dust without crust. You could do managed vegetation, drip irrigation to establish vegetation on the surface, which would slow the wind speed down. You could use chemical dust suppressants that create an artificial crust on the surface, or you could do a long-term brine cap. We should have a lot of experience in doing brine caps in Utah and could probably do it a lot more efficiently than they do it in California. There's also a bunch of options that don't require water. You can cover the surface with gravel. Not very appealing from visual or habitat, but you could do it. You could do tillage. And this is not your farmer's field where you have a tillage, that's a furrow that's only a foot deep. These are massive, 4 to 5 foot deep furrows. But they only work in areas that have high silt and clay contents. They don't work well in sand because they would just fill back in. And then you have artificial roughness, basically putting obstacles on the lake bed to slow the wind speed down. And these could be anything from sand fences to physical obstacles out there to solar panels. They all act the same way to slow the wind speed down. I don't have time to go through each of these, but I do want to emphasize that everything comes with a trade-off. Some of these require water, significant trade-off. Some of these provide no habitat for wildlife. That's a trade-off. Some of these could potentially hurt habitat or disrupt groundwater or other sorts of things. So every one of these has potential trade-offs that need to be experienced or need to be fleshed out in order to figure out whether or not you'd want to do these. And most of them would require a pilot-scale project. So here's just an example of the type of information that is in the report. So we have dynamic water management. Remember, this was moving water around to help reset the crust. It requires dikes, it requires adaptive berms, it requires pumps, other infrastructure out on the lake bed to manage the movement of water. That infrastructure is in a very harsh environment, and typically would have an expected lifetime of only 20 to 30 years. It does provide a good aesthetic value, some good habitat. The ecological risks are moderate, but the costs are about $39 million per square mile. Based upon the estimates from California, and it's about 1.5% of that initial capital cost per year for maintenance. And then you have a brine cap, where you literally pump salt water out onto an area that has been divided by berms. You evaporate that water, that's a cost, and then you establish a salt crust that then acts as a barrier to the wind. It's pretty low aesthetic value, it's pretty low habitat value, and the costs are almost $30 million per square mile. And we have a lot of square miles out there. We'll talk about that in a minute. Gravel. It's a picture of gravel out on Owens Lake. It basically protects the surface by slowing the wind speed down. It works best if you have a geotextile fabric underneath of it so that the gravel doesn't eventually end up moving into the soil. Not much aesthetic value, not much habitat, and the costs are higher at about $45 million per square mile. Expected lifetime, 20 to 50 years, depending upon how frequently it's inundated with water and silt gets put in there. And another example is that tillage, where you have those deep furrows. Expected lifetime is really short because it will erode away. The higher the sand content, the faster it will erode away. Not much aesthetic value, not much habitat. And the only advantage of this one is that it's really cheap. By comparison, it's only $615,000 per square mile. But it has a very high ongoing cost from year to year because of the short lifetime of the tillage. And that's an example of the types of information that are in the report. And then the dust mitigation cost methodology. Whoops. So we took those costs per square mile and multiplied it by the area to be mitigated to come up with an initial capital cost. And then we added in the annual maintenance costs and then the inflation-adjusted infrastructure replacement costs, because these things only tend to last anywhere from 15 to 40 years, to come up with a cost estimate. So looking at the 50-year cumulative cost estimates, this is just for on a per square mile base. We've got the high cost items, which are precision surface wetting, managed vegetation, porous engineered, and solid natural. So these are putting obstacles out on the lake bed. The costs are more than $300 million per square mile, and then you have to multiply that by the square mileage. Medium cost, chemical dust suppressants, dynamic water management, precision surface flooding, brine cap, and gravel. And then low cost would be tillage and natural revegetation. Natural revegetation is risky because it's dependent upon the weather. If you revegetate part of the lake bed and you have drought or you have flooding, it can take out all of that work that you did. So how many square miles do we possibly have to mitigate? Well, there is 21 square miles of dust hotspots documented in Farmington Bay. There's 19 square miles in Gilbert Bay, 16 in Gunnison Bay, and 13 in Bear River Bay, for a total of 70 square miles. That's about 9% of the lake bed. The protective crust that I talked about, if that protective crust were to degrade over time, you could actually end up with about 24% of the lake could actually end up as a dust hotspot, worst case scenario, which would increase the dust hotspot area from 70 square miles to up to 187 square miles. So what are the 50-year costs associated with this? So the report breaks it out in terms of costs in Farmington Bay, Gilbert Bay, Gunnison Bay, Bear River Bay, and 50-year total. And I just want to focus in on the costs associated with Farmington Bay. So if you did precision surface wetting for the entire thing, you're talking about almost $10 billion over a 50-year period. If you move all the way down to tillage, it would be $1 billion. But what you're going to find out is that none of these engineered control systems can work everywhere. And a realistic system is going to be a mishmash of the different engineering solutions if you had to go down that route. And just to give you an idea of what the lake bed could look like if you went down the engineered solution pathway, it's kind of scary. So I'll give you two hypothetical scenarios. These are not endorsements. In fact, they should be cautionary tales. So here's an example where they closed up the berm, or closed up the exit point for water from Farmington Bay to back it up to 4198 or so, and that's the blue. That covers up about 45% of the dust hotspots. And then we use precision surface wetting, the blue, on part of the lake bed. We use tillage on the brown, would be another part where you have high silt and clay. You've got some gravel out there, which is the dark gray. And on this one, I put in solar panels out on the lake bed. It's not even legal, but just saying it's an option, Solar panels, by the way, that would be 10 square miles of solar panels, which would be one of the largest solar farms on the planet. You could do this at a cost of about $3.5 billion, but you would generate revenue from the solar panels. But more realistically, hypothetical scenario number 2 does a mishmash of dynamic water management, the blue, brine caps being purple, the tillage being brown, precision surface wetting blue, natural vegetation in there as well, at a cost of about initial total capital cost of $1 billion, 50-year cost of about $6.7 billion with a B. This is expensive. And once you go down this pathway, you have permanently altered the nature of the lake bed. And there's no going back from that. Just talk to the people at Owens Lake. So other considerations, when you're trying to figure out, which of these dust techniques might work in different areas, you have to look at the topography, the soil texture, the salinity, existing vegetation. All these sorts of things come into play upon which of these dust control measures would work where. And that's beyond the scope of the project. If the state wants to know that, they need to work with an engineering firm who can actually figure out which dust control measures could work where best. So the key takeaway message is, engineered solutions do exist for dust mitigation, but the costs and the long-term obligations are enormous. I'll change substantial to enormous, billions of dollars. There are lots of ecological and water trade-offs associated with every one of these. There is no solution without trade-offs. So some of these increase evaporation, some of these impact sensitive habitats. Most of these dust control measures will require pilot scale feasibility studies to see how well they actually work at Great Salt Lake. The weight of the evidence framework, I think, is a valid way to determine whether or not we need to go down a dust mitigation pathway. And I think what I'm hoping is that we all recognize that the nature-based solution of working hard to restore the lake to ecological health is probably the most cost-beneficial and ecologically sound way to reduce dust, and you'll get dust reduction as a co-benefit. When I did my research about and identified arsenic as being a contaminant of potential concern in on the lake bed, Pat Bagley put out this cartoon that said, "Guys, let's go to the scariest, most terrifying attraction in Utah, Great Salt Lake." Well, when I started looking at the numbers associated with dust mitigation, engineered solutions, I get even more scared. And so I think that this is a cartoon that stands the test of time, not only for what's in the dust, but for what it would cost to cover it up, which is why we need to focus on nature-based solution of restoring lake to ecological health. And I just want to say, if you have, I'm happy to answer questions here. If you want to reach out to me, there's various ways you can do that: by email, Instagram, Facebook, or I have a Substack newsletter called Salt and Sky Brief, where I talk about air quality issues, water quality issues, energy, and anything that excites me on that particular week. So thank you very much. If you talk right into it.
All right. First off, thank you. But also, I think it's really important that we're keeping in mind, of course, you mentioned the ecological aspects of this. I think a lot of not necessarily people here, but a lot of the public see the playa as just an issue of dust, right? But of course, that is habitat within itself for snowy plovers and things like that. Are there any specific regulations that you guys have looked into on all these different techniques, how they would possibly affect that kind of habitat? Or
yeah, all of that would have to be looked at. It's highly disruptive of the natural habitat, and in terms of regulations, I mean, the Forestry, Fire, and State Lands, controls all of the lake bed, and anything that would be done out there would have to have their approval. So there are checks and balances, I guess, in terms of getting the approval from the state for that.
Yeah, so one thing I haven't heard mentioned in the talk about dust remediation would be is the biotic soil crust that forms on these soils. I mean, if they're no longer being seasonally inundated, they are self-repairing, self-sustaining, and then the remediation and water input would be pretty short-term. So has that been taken into consideration at all? Yeah,
there are three different kinds of crust. There's a salt crust, there's a physical crust that has to do with the cohesion of the silt and clay, and then there are also biological crusts. The biological crusts, as soon as it dries out, they start to break up pretty quickly. There's no cryptobiotic crust out there like you see in other areas. So the crusts out there are pretty ephemeral, I guess is what I would say. One last question, I think.
Yeah, Kevin, you looked at the current hotspots, but have you looked at extrapolating that to the whole lake bed? Were we to lose the lake entirely?
Yeah, so the issue with the dust hotspots is that they occur in the same places year after year. Because a dust hotspot is a dust hotspot because they happen to be in areas where you have inefficient transport of wicking of water. And so we've mapped out where these areas are that dry out on the playa. And so I think as the lake bed continues to dry out, I mean, people always ask me, is it going to get worse? Well, Farmington Bay is already completely dry. Bear River Bay is already completely dry. So those are the areas that are closest to people, and they're already dry, and we already know where the dust hotspots are. So I'm not really anticipating a significant increase over time for the dust because this crust resets every winter. And then starts to degrade as we move in. The place where you could have increased dust hotspots would be the south part, Gilbert Bay. Now, the Gunnison Bay up north, as the water is evaporating, you're getting a really thick salt crust. That's breaking that up. Anyway, I think I'm out of time, so sorry.
Good afternoon. I'm Blake Bingham. I'm the Deputy State Engineer, so Deputy Director of the Division of Water Rights. It's great to be here. Just this brings back memories when I was a newly appointed Deputy State Engineer 4 years ago and attended the first one of these. And just credit to Linda Freitas, who is just so gracious and so welcoming to me in my new role. And she's a credit to this organization and all the efforts going on in the Great Salt Lake. So I'm just excited for this opportunity to talk about something that I think might be new to most of you. I know there are a few people who have probably seen this presentation before. This Great Salt Lake Distribution Management Plan. It's kind of a unique plan in and of itself. The state engineer, just for a little background, we are charged with the administrative supervision of the waters of the state of Utah. And so that means the water rights, making sure water is getting to the right place at the right time to those who have a right. And so, as you know, we are just one of many organizations who touch the lake in this space, and this list continues to grow every time I do this presentation. I probably need to add a few more organizations. And I think someone earlier talked about, I think it was Hannah, mentioned that there's a little bit of Great Salt Lake fatigue going on in kind of the zeitgeist. And I think part of that is that there's also Great Salt Lake plan fatigue because there are so many plans out there, and you're going to hear a few more plans. So this is just one of the many plans. And as we kind of look at it, this is a great graphic that captures the essence of how these plans nest within one another. And so you talk about the Great Salt Lake Commissioner's Strategic Plan, which is kind of the overarching plan, and then the Great Salt Lake Basin Integrated Plan done by the Division of Water Resources. You have the Watershed Enhancement Trust, so we're out there looking to get water to the lake. And then you have our Distribution Management Plan, which is how we're going to manage water in the lake. And then, of course, the Comprehensive Management Plan, which I believe Ben is going to discuss following my presentation. So a lot of plans, each of them have their specific objectives, and I think this plan that I'm about to talk to you about is very unique. It's the first of its kind that I know of, definitely in the state of Utah. So let's get into it. So back in the 2024 legislative session, House Bill 453 did a number of things related to the Great Salt Lake. But one of the main elements as far as our office is concerned is it directed the state engineer to develop the Great Salt Lake Distribution Management Plan. And in that, it said the state engineer, we can look at various factors, including the hydrology of the basin, lake elevation, salinity, amount of water dedicated to the lake, and any other relevant factors. So there's kind of that big catch-all. We can look at all these things when looking at the Great Salt Lake in order to address the water rights on the lake. And maybe some context to why this was even initiated is for a longest time there's been this sense amongst a lot of the agricultural producers who live upstream of the lake, why are we asked to conserve water or forego water to send it to the lake when maybe there's some mineral extraction entities in the lake that just have a pool of water and they continue to operate year round. And so as a result of that, there was a lot of thought put in, well, maybe we need to look at regulating those water rights within the lake and when and how they're able to divert. As part of it, they directed us to develop a priority schedule. That might be a new term. Just think of in Utah water law, if you have a senior water right, meaning you have an early water right, you get to satisfy your water before the next water right holder has in order of seniority. And so when we look at that and we put those on a list, that's called a priority schedule. So the seniors at the top, juniors at the bottom. They directed us to develop a priority schedule for Great Salt Lake water rights, and I'll kind of get to the definition of what a Great Salt Lake water right is here shortly. And then also develop kind of a public-facing distribution accounting tool. One of the questions we routinely get asked is, hey, how do we know what the water that's getting dedicated is getting to the lake? And what is that volume? What does that look like? What are the water rights that are being dedicated? Are we accounting for it? Are we tracking it? And so these are some of the things that we were directed to look at. So, and then we were given a very short time. I think we were given like 18 months to do this. Generally, when we do management plans, like groundwater management plans, it's over years. Obviously, with the state of the lake, we didn't have that luxury, and we were given a statutory deadline of October 1st, 2025 to have it in place. And so we had to get to work right away. This is just kind of an overview of the different sections. I know this can be a little bit hard for a lot of you to read, so don't worry about trying to look at it. There is the QR code if you want to go to our website and take a look at the plan. I'm just going to warn you, it is very Spartan with regard to graphics. We're engineers, not Imagineers, so it's pretty much a Word document with a couple tables. So it's nothing super fancy. But that's not the value of the document. I hope we all realize that is what it does with regard to the lake. So I'm just going to kind of go through these sections in turn, talk about what's in them, hit the high notes, and then we'll open it up to some questions. It'll be a pretty quick presentation, I think. So the first is just talking about the administrative responsibilities that the state engineer has with respect to the Great Salt Lake. First, it talks about the waters of the state of Utah are property of the public. It's just kind of a common theme. They're not owned by anyone. They're owned by the people, managed by the state. And the state engineer is, as I said, responsible for the general administrative supervision of those waters. That includes the measurement, appropriation, apportionment, and distribution. So measurement's easy. Appropriation means, hey, if you want to get a new water right. Apportionment means, hey, if a water right falls out of priority and we need to curtail it, that's apportionment. And then distribution, just think of delivery. The state engineer apportions and distributes waters according to the respective rights of the appropriators. This is the doctrine of prior appropriation. It's a common tenet in Western water law. And then something that is new to our office is this concept of the multiple use sustained yield. So when we regulate water rights, it's always on priority. That's kind of the law. And so in order to regulate them using some other element or variable, there was another framework that had to be incorporated that is specific to this plan, and that's this concept of multiple use sustained yield. So it provides a little bit more narrative context that, hey, the Great Salt Lake, we recognize it fluctuates over time. We do have some specific elevations listed in the plan, and a lot of those elevations resemble some of the elevations used in the strike team analysis, the comprehensive management plan. You'll see these kind of key elevation marks, and we just want to say, hey, we took those into consideration. Some of them might correlate, and some of them might not, but there is some at least overlap, some Venn diagram overlap there. Some things that the plan does not do or does not allow for does not provide for a priority call upstream of the Great Salt Lake. So you have these water rights in the Great Salt Lake. It does not extend beyond the border, meaning we can start curtailing waters upstream, and that was explicitly required by the legislature. And to be honest with you, the water rights in the Great Salt Lake are actually very junior, so the possibility of actually curtailing upstream water rights probably moot. Great Salt Lake matters outside the scope of the plan. So again, we focus on the Great Salt Lake water rights, and I'll just kind of cut to the chase. The Great Salt Lake water right is essentially defined as a water right within the meander line of the Great Salt Lake that's used for mineral extraction purposes. That's kind of the high-level definition. Most of the water that's physically present above the bed of the lake is not associated with Great Salt Lake water rights. It's just kind of freeboard water, or dedicated water for that matter. the decisions or actions associated in the Great Salt Lake that don't relate to the Great Salt Lake water rights or dedicated water are the responsibility of the relevant agency. So the plan doesn't regulate how the adaptive management berm is handled or tell Forestry, Fire, State Lands how to manage their statutory responsibilities, those types of things. It's very specific and narrow as far as what its regulatory scope is. Statutory mandate, it's just that's the section of code. You can find it under 7333. It was modeled very much closely to how we look at groundwater management plans. There's a lot of similar framework of how they're adopted, how we interact and talk about voluntary arrangements, those types of things, but there are things that are very specific to the Great Salt Lake in it. The primary objective, establishing requirements for the accurate measurement, quantification, and reporting of diversions, depletions, and return flows of those Great Salt Lake water rights. Again, think of the mineral extractive rights. And developing procedures for the equitable apportionment and distribution of those rights. Some of the things that we could look at, the physical characteristics of the lake. As I go through this, we did use the elevations as the primary indicator. However, salinity comes into play with regard to how much we look at evaporative losses relating to dedicated water contributions. We looked at the priorities outlined in the Great Salt Lake Commissioner's Strategic Plan and the Comprehensive Management Plan, and how these Great Salt Lake water rights, what their characteristics are. Here are the terms. Dedicated water, you'll hear that term often. Just think of water that has essentially had a change application filed on it. Usually these are from upstream water right holders. They'll file a change application in connection with the Division of Forestry, Fire, and State Lands or the Division of Wildlife Resources. Often the Great Salt Lake Water Enhancement Trust is involved to facilitate the transaction, or now the Great Salt Lake Commissioner's Office, taking that water and essentially abandoning the use that it was used for and shepherding that water to the lake. So then it could be used in the lake. There is also water that has been dedicated by mineral extraction entities that is already in the lake itself. Some of these we don't really need definition. You know what the Great Salt Lake meander line is. Ben's going to talk about the Comprehensive Management Plan. Great Salt Lake Water Right, we've already kind of touched that. And the Great Salt Lake Watershed, we know what that is. It's the basin. Okay, the main element. So this is kind of a summary, okay? It defines the Great Salt Lake water rights, dedicated water. We apportion those Great Salt Lake water rights based on prior appropriation and multiple use sustained yield. The elevations in the plan are kind of intended to be in harmony with, but not necessarily same as other elevations. It doesn't govern other unrelated actions, adaptive management, berm modifications, or anything else. Does not provide for a priority call upstream, and it allows for voluntary arrangements of these mineral entities to kind of help facilitate some of these transactions. Here is the list of the Great Salt Lake water rights. Now, prior to a few months ago, U.S. Magnesium used to be on this list. You'll see actually now Forestry and Fire State Lands is the owner of several of these water rights due to their acquisition of both U.S. Magnesium as well as working with Compass Minerals to acquire some of those rights as well. So these are the water rights we're talking about when we say Great Salt Lake water rights. And just a kind of administrative note, is change applications happen or segregations or title updates happen, we're just going to update that without going through the whole formal amendment plan of the plan process, because there's a whole timeline spelled out in statute which we have to go through in order to do that. Just recognize that, hey, these are administrative in nature. We're just going to update the plan once they happen. Okay, this is the water that we currently have. I updated this yesterday. Actually, I'm still missing one of them on here. So these are the water rights that have been dedicated to the Great Salt Lake. Again, you'll see that little note down there, and total dedicated water approved is over 500,000 acre feet. Again, that's the approved portion. That doesn't mean that's the amount that's going into the lake every year. We'll talk about how we look at that and how we track that. But it's growing, and it grows every month. We get a new dedicated water application in, dedicating water to the lake. But you can see there's been a significant process thanks to the efforts of the Great Salt Lake Water Enhancement Trust, the Commissioner's Office, and of course our sister agencies, both Division of Wildlife Resources and the Division of Forestry, Fire, and State Lands. And one important note, so one cool feature about dedicated water, once it's in the lake, that is kind of protected from being diverted by mineral extraction entities. So it's a big lake, so we still got a long way to go before the mineral extraction agencies ever have to worry about this. But it's just kind of one of those features, hey, once we get it in the water, in the lake, we're going to protect it. Let's talk about apportionment and distribution. I talked about the priority schedule. How we looked at developing this priority schedule is we identified all the Great Salt Lake water rights, lined them up by their initial priority date. And so you kind of go back here. So it's organized by priority date in this. The most senior in the upper left, the most junior bottom right. So you can see the earliest Great Salt Lake water right was appropriated back in 1940, okay? So we kind of have this schedule, and then we said, hey, you know what? The easiest way to go about this is to apportion water rights based on the lake level. And said, well, that prompted the question, okay, well, what lake level do we use? And we looked to some of the voluntary agreements that Forestry Fire State Lands had entered into, and they said, hey, in their agreements with the different mineral extraction entities, they used the USGS gauge at Saltair Boat Harbor on the June 15th of every year. So he said, we will do the same. So every year we look at that USGS gauge in Saltair Boat Harbor and say, all right, June 15th, this is the elevation. That's the elevation that we're going to use to apportion the water rights. And I'll talk about what that apportionment looks like here in the next slide or two. And then the water rights that fall outside the priority schedule, meaning if they're out of priority or meaning the lake's too low and they're too junior, they are curtailed for starting that next January. So we measure on June 15th. That priority schedule comes into place January 1 of the following year. So right now we look for this year in 2026, we are using the lake elevation as measured in June 15th of 2025, which I believe was 4193 on the money, interestingly enough. New appropriation of the Great Salt Lake water rights. The governor has a proclamation currently in place which suspends all new appropriations except for some exceptions to that, small amounts of water. But in essence, if you appropriate a new water right, you've got to have some type of a replacement plan to account for the depletion. Any new applications, we're just going to consider them on their own merits. Okay, let's talk about dedicated water and how the priority schedule interacts with that. So when you have a dedicated water application, for those water rights for those Great Salt Lake water rights, so again, I'm talking about the water rights inside the Great Salt Lake. Let's say Compass Minerals, so they filed a change application on a portfolio of their water rights. So at some point they are on the priority schedule saying at this lake level you're not allowed to divert this water. Well, under a change application, they're essentially taken out of that priority schedule and into kind of a separate priority schedule that is a little bit more lenient, allows them to go a little bit deeper, but the trade-off is they then have dedicated the balance of that water to Great Salt Lake, and they've also made some other agreements with Forestry Fire State Lands about giving them some of those water rights. So we'll talk a little bit what that looks like. Any Great Salt Lake water rights with approved change application has to have a valid contractual agreement with Forestry Fire State Lands. They're not subject to the curtailment under the priority schedule. They kind of act in their own priority schedule here off to the side. And then as future change applications are filed, we'll update the plan without going through the formal process. Okay, here's kind of what the best representation of the priority schedule looks like. This is a graphical. In truth, it's just a table. It's really boring, but this is way more interesting than the table, and you can get it in one slide too. So again, as we look at this, I got 10 minutes remaining. I got to go quick. All right. So, this is the most important part. So I'm just going to hit this. All right. So as you look at this, below 4193, there's no diversions allowed of any Great Salt Lake water rights. And then as you go up every tranche to 4193 to 4195, there's a little bit more water allowed based on priority. You can see it goes from priority dates 1940 to 1962 and onwards and upwards. Again, we measure it June 15th of every year. We implement it the calendar year following year. I think I've covered the rest of that. Voluntary arrangements, I've touched on this quickly. Forestry Fire State Lands has entered into voluntary arrangements with numerous of the mineral extraction entities and have filed change applications, and the plan allows for that. We developed this distribution accounting tool, which essentially takes all these factors into place, both the the salinity when we're looking at how much water, dedicated water remains in the lake year after year. We looked at the quantity of, so you can go to this tool, and I'll give you a link to it here shortly, and you can actually see the lake elevation. You can see what the lake elevation would have been without the dedicated water. You can see, and then you can see this, and I know you guys cannot really read these tables at all. Go to the tool, play around with it, but I'm just going to quickly summarize. So on the left here, this is kind of our account balance. So this is for 2020, the end of the year, 2025. You can see all the dedicated water change applications with how much water we have accounted for. So this isn't what was authorized. This is actually what was delivered and accounted for in the lake. So you have a beginning of the year balance of 217,000. You add all this water up, and then you take off some evaporation of the dedicated water, and you end up with a balance of 476,126 acre feet. So that's kind of where you would go to say, hey, how much dedicated water is currently in the lake? You have the teacup diagram that kind of spells that out up top. And then off to your right-hand side, that's essentially the active priority schedule. It'll show what water rights are available for diversion according to which company. Those clusters of water rights have a little A number. Those are the ones that have those change applications. So they have a little bit different priority schedule. But you can see I still have U.S. Magnesium down there at the very bottom. That's now owned by Forestry and Fire State Lands. You can see based on the lake elevation of June 15th, 2025, which would have been 4193, they wouldn't have been able to divert this year. So they would have been curtailed 100% because they did not enter into a voluntary agreement with Forestry, Fire State Lands and file a change application. So this is how you can track to see what water is available for diversion by these entities. And then of course we are trying to redouble our efforts on the measurement and monitoring of all the diversions and return flows. And this is just the essentially glide path that's happened. You know, we started off March 12th, 2024. We adopted the plan October 1st, 2025, and then it went into effect for the first time January 1st, 2026. Okay, that was a speed round. I wish I would have maybe been a little bit more even paced, but there we are. I guess I could have some time for some questions if there are any questions. All right, it looks like I answered everything for everyone, so nailed it. All right, thank you. You know where to find me, Blake Bingham, utah.gov. If you need to email me, always happy to talk Salt Lake stuff. It's one of my passions, and I'm just grateful for the opportunity to present. Thanks, everyone.
All right. Hello, my name is Ben Stireman. I'm the Deputy Director of the Division of Forestry, Fire, and State Lands. And today I'm here to talk to you about our update to the Great Salt Lake Comprehensive Management Plan and the Great Salt Lake Mineral Leasing Plan. So for those of you that don't know us, you might be wondering what in the world Forestry, Fire, and State Lands is doing managing Great Salt Lake. But we are the agency that was charged with managing sovereign lands. Some may even say we're the sovereign land squire, for those of you sitting in the back there. So we manage those lands that are lying below the ordinary high water mark of navigable bodies of water at the date of statehood. They include Bear Lake, Bear River, Great Salt Lake, Green and Colorado Rivers, Utah Lake, and Jordan River. So we have a statutory mandate to update these management plans, and Great Salt Lake has not been updated since 2013. I know you're all here because you care about Great Salt Lake, so you probably know that a lot has changed since 2013. We've seen new record low lake levels. We started to manage the berm. There's been tons of statute changes, regulations, laws, things that have come into effect. You've heard it all day about all the different things we're learning about Great Salt Lake. Just a tremendous amount of research has gone into that. One example I'll also use is that really kind of I'll touch on later when we talk about our Great Salt Lake level matrix is bioherms or microbialites. Like we really just didn't know a lot about those in 2013. I think we knew enough to talk about them a little bit, but we know a lot more and a lot more about how they're affected with low lake levels and some of the other issues that happen when we hit high salinity levels and other thresholds. Here's just a little snippet about the need for these updated plans, a few headlines that have happened, and other things that we're managing. We also have a tremendous amount of funding that's being allocated towards Great Salt Lake. So again, there's a real need to think about how we're going to manage this important resource. So I want to talk a little bit about how these plans are updated. What we have done is we start with a public process. So what we did in this case is we actually went out and had open houses in every one of the counties surrounding Great Salt Lake. We also had a public open house that was done virtually for those that couldn't attend in person. And then we had a survey on our website where stakeholders, partners, others could come in and let us know what was important to them. I'll give you a little glimpse into some of the survey results that we had. Then we start to review existing information, incorporate all of the new laws and regulations and everything that's happened since the last time we updated a plan, update our management classifications. These act a whole lot like a zoning map, so those have to be updated now that we know new information, and also given the different needs and desires of those that want to use sovereign lands. We also incorporate, in the case of Great Salt Lake, our lake level matrix and some of the management approaches that come with the fluctuating lake levels, work with a multidisciplinary planning team, and coordinate with all of our federal, state, and other local stakeholders. And then we go back after we get a draft and start with step one again, and we do a little bit of public outreach once we have a draft. So after all of this is done, we'll put it back out, and that's when we officially take comments and respond to them at the end, and then eventually adopt a final plan. So out of those surveys, here I wanted to give you a few examples of some of the things we asked and what we heard. So we did ask stakeholders, what locations are important? Like, what do you want us to focus on? Do you like Farmington Bay, or is it the WMAs? Is it, Saltair? Is it Gilbert Bay where the brine shrimp are? I mean, tell us a little bit more about where you think we should really focus, or is it just the whole lake? And we got a pretty good amount of different responses. Overwhelmingly, I think the whole lake was really the response that we heard, which I'm happy to hear people are thinking about the lake as a whole. We also heard from folks the most important issues. If I can read my own slides here, we've got development, lake level management strategies, birds. Temperature was one that surprised me. I really didn't think that was on folks' radar, but that is something that we heard a lot about. And then a few other issues that were highlighted. We also asked what the number one barrier to the effective implementation of the plan would be. And you can see there's three of them that have to do with agencies, whether it's funding, support for agencies, or even just coordination among agencies. That was interesting to me because my experience working for the state over the last 10 years is that the Great Salt Lake is one of the most coordinated projects, if you want to call it that, or management things that we actually do. There's a really tight-knit group, and you can see that just by the people standing here in the room today, that there's a lot of different agencies and people that are supportive of the actions to help manage Great Salt Lake. And while we each have our individual mandates or interests, my thought is that we're all kind of swimming in the same direction. So I thought that was really interesting. And then another confusing aspect that we got out of that is that some management they want to see management policies that are very prescriptive, but also management policies that are not too prescriptive. So we're trying to find ourselves somewhere in the middle there. So a little bit about the CMPs. What they do is they help us to manage sovereign lands under the public trust doctrine, or the principles of the public trust doctrine. They help us to affect management strategies that balance the various interests, ensure that we're managing under that sustained yield multiple use principle, and then they clarify for folks that want to use sovereign lands what would be allowable, like what type of activities we would consider for the use of sovereign lands. And there is also things that they don't do. So they don't duplicate the work of other agencies. Forestry, Fire, and State Lands is the executive management authority of Great Salt Lake. We manage under the public trust doctrine. We also manage for several public interests, such as wildlife, habitat, water quality, other things that a lot of other agencies are working on. So we don't try to manage all of those things, but when we're making decisions that could affect, for example, wildlife, we try to make decisions that will help support our partners and make sure that that's happening. We also don't manage upstream water. Like Blake said, this is not about upstream water management. We don't manage conservation, upstream, or supply water management, none of that. We also don't operate reservoirs upstream, and we don't manage the inflows or groundwater to Great Salt Lake. Those are all things that we do not manage or won't address in these plans. I did want to touch a little bit on the mineral leasing plan, because as we're talking about updating these plans, and I mentioned at the first, we are updating the mineral leasing plan. So I'll touch on this a little bit later, but we're trying to modernize how we use these plans. One of the things that we've done with the mineral leasing plan is, instead of saying, here's what you can do and what you can't do with the mineral leasing plan, and almost having to duplicate a lot of the work we did in the other plan, we're really just talking about what the resource is. So what are the minerals that are there in Great Salt Lake? How are they characterized? What's currently being produced? What is the regulatory climate, for mineral production? Blake talked about HB 453 and the water distribution plan. That also had a lot to do with mineral production. It provided our division, Forestry, Fire, and State Lands, a process for how we would deal with like lithium extraction. You're going to hear a little bit about that, I think, tomorrow. We have a company that Waterleaf, Lilac. I think I've seen a few folks here in the crowd that are going to be talking about that tomorrow, that have gone through the first ever feasibility and operations application process to get to the point where they could get a royalty agreement from the state to operate out there, but they had to prove to the state that they weren't going to harm the lake. So this mineral leasing plan tells you how you would go about going through that process, and kind of helps to simplify it. There's like 40 pages of rules that are associated with that, because this is an incredibly delicate and important resource. So we want to be very specific, but we wanted to give folks a tool to use to be able to navigate that. We also have kind of diverged from saying, here's what you can do as it relates to mineral leasing, more in alignment with saying, here are the surface use activities that you can do. And so, like, for example, if you need to have a pipeline for your mineral operation, you would just use our normal CMP to do that. You wouldn't look at the mineral leasing plan, but you would need to have a royalty agreement, which you would use the mineral leasing plan for. So I'll touch a little bit on this later to kind of tie those things together again. I also wanted to just mention as well, you've kind of heard from a lot of different agencies, and I've seen different graphics about how our agencies all are kind of surrounding each other, but you're also hearing, I think, 3 or 4 different segments right now about different plans that are underway, and I think you all are aware that there's dozens of other plans that exist. And so again, it might sound like there's just a million plans and we're all doing these different things. Our comprehensive management plan and the Great Salt Lake Commissioner's strategic plan are kind of meant to bring those into the center and incorporate all of the things that we know out of those other plans into our plan, so it can help us to make those decisions. Otherwise, we'd have like a 2,000-page document that nobody would ever touch. So I like to kind of think of these updates to these CMPs like remodeling your house. And in this case, we could have slapped some paint on it and called it a day. But we're taking this down to the studs. We're going to take everything that was good about our old CMP, and we're going to make it better. And then we're also going to redesign, how we look at these CMPs. I guess I should say, I have looked at these, and I think my biggest criticism of our old plans is they kind of read like a NEPA document or a book report. They're very voluminous, and the moment they get published, they start to become outdated. And so if we're only updating these every 10 years, what are we doing putting it all in one document? I think we should have something that's adaptive, that can be updated as we learn more, and we're constantly learning. We are putting hundreds of thousands of dollars a year into research. Everybody here is related to the lake some way or another, so we want to be able to update that and adapt. Also, I think there's some money savings to be had in that. I think in the long term, if we keep things adaptive, then we're only updating a small segment of our plan, and we can probably do that in-house. So long term, it's going to be a bit more sustainable for our division. So again, I kind of talked about this modern update. We're going from the static version to the dynamic version. For those of you that really like to be able to hold a plan, we're going to still have something you can print off and you can hold it. But for those of you that like to use your phones and the internet, this will be good for you. So we have a modern update and an online tool that will help you visualize current vulnerabilities based on lake levels and salinities. It links the existing conditions with corresponding management activities, considers the what-ifs that you might be interested in, and it leaves room for us to update it as we learn more. So I want to talk a little bit about how we use the static document, because like I said, that will exist. Some of the land use classifications, even the elevation matrix, we're still going to have that version that exists today. And we're not going to use our updated like I would say, our adaptive model to make decisions. That's going to be more of a window into like what we're doing. Like if you want to know how we're managing differently at 4192 than we would at 4198, or if the lake's going up or down, during these levels, or if the salinity's high or if it's low, this is where you would go to find that. But in the static version, that's where that classification map comes up. So we classify from 1 to 6, 1 being more open for consideration of existing uses or development, and then 6 being the most protective of the resource. So this is a comparison of the new and the old map, and it does have a new color scheme. We're going to try to make sure that all future plans use the same color scheme, but we're also under this new mandate with ADA, so we're rethinking everything. So anyway, we're trying to balance, again, various objectives here to make this all work. But what I wanted to talk about on this is that there are some big changes that you can see there. So Class 1, there's not a lot of Class 1. Class 1 is really where there have been existing impacts or development. So mineral extraction is really the most notable of those. We also have like boat harbors, the causeway, a few other places where you're going to see that they're Class 1. And those are going to be the least restrictive. We're going to probably look at, like if the railroad is going to renew their lease, we would look at like that would be an option. It wouldn't be ruled out. Class 2 is where we know that there could be potential activity. You'll notice there's not very much Class 2 at all. Really, the main area where we have Class 2 is the U.S. Magnesium footprint, where there's part of their old lease, but it's not something where it's actually been developed. And the reason we kept that as a Class 2 is as others have mentioned, we purchased U.S. Magnesium this year and now have an obligation to, go through with some remediation. And we have a lot of ideas about other really cool things that we can do in Stansbury Bay, but it's probably going to take some work, out there to get water back to the lake, to do remediation. There's going to be some work. So we know there's likely something to come there. And that's kind of the idea behind Class 2, is that we know there's likely going to be impacts. So, let's think through that. Class 6 encumbers the WMAs, the areas that we think are, super sensitive that aren't within the WMAs or the bird refuge areas, are Class 5, so they have a high level of protection. And then the rest of the lake is kind of open for, consideration of any of the different uses. And I want to talk a little bit about how that plays out. So, we can talk about what class it is and how we, classify them, but how do you actually use that? So part of this new Explorer tool will allow you to go online and you can look at other layers, things that are important, and maybe so like a kind of a window into how we, found or arrived at these conclusions. And you can actually click on the map. This is new for us. So you can click on the map and you can actually look at the classification, and it'll tell you, like, if you want to graze this area, is that allowable or is it not allowable? And then there's this other category called potentially allowable, and it basically says, if it was allowable, the team, everybody got together, all of our subject matter experts got together and said, this is something that we should allow. It's very minimal on the impact. We all agreed that this is something that would just go through the normal permitting process. So they still have to get a permit. There's still a comment period. There's still time to, protest or, go through that. But the potentially allowable adds an extra step. It's what we call a site-specific plan. And it's kind of like our Forestry, Fire, and State Lands version of like an environmental assessment. We would likely, depending on the project, we'd be reaching out to DWR to say, hey, what do you think about this from a fishery perspective, or from, migratory birds or whatnot, or water quality? Like, can you tell us if you have any concerns about the project from water quality? And then we may go back to the permittee or the lessee and say, you got to do X, Y, and Z. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to permit that. Or maybe there's no impacts and we're able to move on to the next stage and go through the permitting. So it's a cool new tool that'll give you a chance to kind of see, how these things are managed from that perspective. This is the first time that we're kind of rolling this out to the public, and we figured this would be a good place to do it. You all are like what we would consider to be the closest to the lake. So if you snap this QR code, you can go to our website here, and there's a survey where you can look at how we've classified these lands. And when you click them, you can also look at that land use classification table. So you can kind of get an idea of what type of activities we would allow and what would not be allowed. So this gives you a chance to give us some feedback. Like I said, this isn't the official comment period where we're doing the draft and are going to respond to your comments, but what we're trying to do is get to the point where we have very little comments when we get to the draft. We want to hear what you have to say now so we can do our very best to incorporate that and get to a good spot when we're done here. And if there's something we overlooked, I'm not too proud to admit it. We'll figure it out, and we'll move on, and we'll try to make it right there. So please take the survey, and if you need a link for this, we can give that to you later as well. So again, this is kind of a snapshot of the survey. So again, when you click on one of these areas, you can kind of see that land use table there that says what's allowable and what's potentially allowable, not allowable. This will give you an insight, and you can look at all the different uses we analyzed. If the use that you had in mind is not on there, that's okay. It just means that it's not something that we thought wasn't there. You can comment on there and say, hey, you didn't think about this, and we're happy to give that some consideration, potentially put on there. But this will give you a window into how we kind of make decisions on what would be again, allowable from a perspective of, someone who wants to use sovereign lands for commercial gain or like a private use of sovereign lands. The elevation matrix. Lynn, I see you back there. Lynn has just always told me how much she loves this elevation matrix, and I got to be completely honest. This is one thing this was a tool that was developed in 2013. We're actually in a lawsuit now under this public trust lawsuit, and it's something that is a tool that was developed and I think used kind of to say, hey, this is gauging what the status of the lake, and you guys your own tool says this. And so it gave me a little bit of heartburn to continue to develop the matrix because it's something that we want to use as a tool and we want to put out there so there's a bit of transparency into what we're thinking. But I guess the way that we decided to look at this is that it's really not a scorecard for the lake. It's more about the mitigation effort that it takes. Kevin just told you, Dr. Perry just told you about the fact that there's a way to mitigate for dust. So it's not that dust is going to be bad at a certain level. I think we all can agree on that, and there's a way that you can mitigate for it. You can do technical, engineered efforts. Same thing with salinity. We know that salinity was about to hit a peak that we weren't going to come back from. I mean, we were going to have some serious adverse consequences back in 2022. But guess what? We managed the berm. We got rid of a ton of salt to the north arm, and now we're in one of the best places we could ever be. So we're able to mitigate for some of the low lake levels, some of the salinity levels, things like, things that come up. That's the case with a lot of the things that we've identified on this elevation matrix. And so our goal is to really talk about the level of intervention. The boat harbor. We know at a certain level that boat harbor is not going to be usable when you get out on the, the south shore of the lake. But you can dredge it. And so it takes more intervention. So we're not trying to state that, that this is, these are what you should expect when you go out there. It's what you should expect if nobody's doing anything. So this gives our resource managers a chance to say, the lake is trending downward. Let's think about this thing. Maybe we need to ask for funding a year in advance so we can get that. There's different ways that we would use this to try to understand how we can be more preventative in nature. So here's a draft of that matrix. This is the first time that we put this out here. So today you're just getting a sneak peek into all the work we've been up to for the last bit. You can scan that QR code there, and it'll give you a bigger version of this. I know you can't actually read anything on here, but you can take a look at that and comment on it. If you think we didn't nail it, let us know so we can think about what we may need to adjust if there's something we need to consider there. And I'll just give everybody a second in case anybody needs that still. And there are poster boards, I think, that are out there. And I actually meant to say this at the start. I jumped right into it because I'm just like a workhorse, guys. I like to get right at it. But our team that's doing this plan is phenomenal. We have an incredible staff who's spending just hordes of time updating our Utah Lake and our Great Salt Lakes comprehensive management plans. So a lot of them are here, and I wanted to say thanks. Publicly recognize the Forestry, Fire, and State Land staff, but also Jacobs Engineering. They've just been doing a great job. They are not the contractor that we had used in the past for our plans, but they've done a phenomenal job, and I think I'm probably a pretty hard client. I have a lot of demands and a lot of let's do this crazy thing and let's change the whole thing. We're just going to throw it all out the window and start, going this way. And they've just totally managed it. So anyway, I want to say thanks again to Jacobs Engineering, and I forgot to do that at the start. But you can go get this same QR code in I believe in the lunchroom, or excuse me, back here, and you can give us comments on this as well. And we would love to hear your feedback. So I also wanted to mention as well that this text you can't read, these are all citations that help. Yeah, I know. I know. These are all citations that, if you blow this thing up, you'll be able to see it. But there's tons of new citations that help to support the information that is in this matrix now. So before, I think one of the questions we had is where are people getting this information? Well, now you know. Now you can go do your own research. You can look at a citation that's related to one of these, pull it up, and you can go in and read the paper, and you know where these things are coming from. And Okay, so next, I think I only have a few minutes left. I want to leave some for questions. But next, I just want to talk a little bit about our Explorer. So again, we've kind of taken out all of the book report stuff. We're linking out to other agencies. You know, we know water quality has all kinds of different resources, so we're going to link to their resource. So when they update it and you're on our page, you know you can go to the most current resource and you're not looking at something that's 10 years old. So when you go there, we have tabs that talk about water, land, air, biology, people, and economics, and then there's subtabs under each of those categories. Not only do you get to know a little bit about how it relates to Great Salt Lake, but you can also know what we're doing to manage it. So at a certain level, and our new website will have real-time salinity and lake levels, just like you'd get like on the hydro map or other places where you might go to get those. You can look at this, and now you can know if the lake's trending upward. We're going to be doing things at a certain elevation a little different than we do if the lake was trending downward. So it'll give you a window in like the different management activities that that are being undertaken. And the cool thing about it is that we will continue to update this. So next year, you'll know what we're doing next year. It's not going to be what we were doing in 2026. And in 2035, it's going to be what we're actually doing in 2035, not back in 2026. So I want to just really send that home. This is going to be a living document here, or a living site. So it'll be updated and hopefully useful for eternity. So we're going to have this thing wrapped up here this summer and fall. We hope to have this final CMP done this calendar year. Check out the website. There's other information if you want to see some of the surveys and other things that we have. This should also probably, I hope, and if not, maybe our Jacobs team can link up those other surveys in there. But you can go to this website and see, the planning page and get updates there. You can also sign up for, information as it comes out. And with that, I just want to say thank you, and I think I have maybe a couple minutes that I could answer some questions. All right, nailed it. Thank you. All right. I'm always eager to get off the stage. Public speaking is definitely not my forte.
First of all, I really love the elevation matrix. And
I know you do.
Yeah, I really do. I mean, that was earth-shattering when you included that in the 2013 CMP. So thank you for that. One of the things that a lot of conversation is focused on these days is groundwater. And I'm wondering, I did see maybe groundwater wasn't included in the CMP, or there was some exclusionary, by the way.
Sure.
Where does it get included because of the relevance of what we don't see, but what we need to know about?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it's not that we don't talk about groundwater, Lynn. There's a lot of places where we may reference to characterize, how much groundwater. What I probably poorly stated is we just aren't going to we don't manage how much groundwater comes in. We don't manage upstream diversions. Our plan doesn't, it's not about water delivery. So I guess that's what I was trying to hit on there. But there's a lot of resources to understand groundwater, how much groundwater comes to the lake. In fact, I know Bill's floating around here. I think he may be a recipient of some cool award or something for all the great work he's done. But we even fund research for those types of things, and that's the type of information we'd like to include. We know that groundwater is contributing more than it used to, or than we used to think it did. So those are the kinds of things that we'll continue to update in that matrix. But like I said, we don't get to regulate that side of things. That's just not our bag of tea, and not what the management plan does. So hopefully that answers that. Yeah.
Hey, Ben. Great
Dr. Perry.
Yeah, great presentation.
Yeah, thank you.
Just wanted to see what you can share publicly about the purchase of U.S. Magnesium in terms of the assets and the plans and all that sort of stuff. Would be great.
Well, I don't want to blow the lid off of Jamie's presentation on Friday. So our director, Jamie Barnes, is going to be here Friday to give a presentation on that. So she'll give a little insight. But, I'll just say that this, for us, it was an incredible opportunity to have control over our own destiny. We had a lot to say about the operation there. We were really excited about the opportunity. It wasn't our intention when we started in with when they filed bankruptcy, but the opportunity presented itself, and we're really happy about the decision we made, and we hope that we, receive the support from all of you to continue to do this work. There's going to be a lot of remediation that needs to happen, and a lot of decisions that will need to be made. So I'll leave it to Jamie to kind of describe that. But anyway, I'm still really happy that it happened. It's been a lot of work, but anyway, we'll save the questions for Jamie on that one. I'm sure she'll get a lot. Anything else? Oh, yes, please.
Hi. I think it's lovely that the CMP is considering an elevation rising or falling as two very different conditions. It's too detailed maybe to ask how does the division decide whether something's rising or falling, though I'd like that.
Yeah.
But more concretely, would our record snowpack years have falsely triggered it's rising water levels, go to reduced concerns?
That's a good question. So I think there's, really predictable seasonal rising and falling paradigms. And we're probably looking at more of those seasonal paradigms. Like we know in the spring we're going to tick up, and we know that we're going to go down in the summer. So it's going to change how we consider things. We do that right now, and this is a lot of what we're showing you here is kind of a window into how we've been doing these things since 2013. And so we want to be really transparent and say, we're making decisions that are, based on these things. So we want to show you how we're doing that. One example I'll use is like salinity, and we're going to talk a little. We have a panel tomorrow where I get to hang out with some really cool salinity committee members and ask them hard questions. But we manage it differently in the spring than we do in the fall, and we have different targets in the spring than we do in the fall. That's just one example of like where we may want to do that. Same things with vegetation management. There's a lot of opportunity there, but I think we can give a pretty good reasonable forecast to whether we're trending downward or upward. I mean, there's climatologists and folks out there that can project that for us. And when we're looking at those trends, it does give us a window into doing those things. But we're not talking about like, we're not saying. I mean, we're not making huge decisions here that are going to make drastic changes. We're going to look at the year by year changes and just give a little bit of insight into that. Yeah, thank you. Any other questions? Okay, thank you.
Thank you to our last few speakers. I'm just going to announce that we have a quick break. We will reconvene here at 3:30 sharp for our last four speakers of the day. Thanks, everyone.